Muy buenos días. En
Good
nombre de la
morning. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, we welcome you to this event, COVID-19 in Latin America and the Caribbean, People-Centered Mitigation and Recovery. This conversation has the participation of Luis Alberto Moreno, President of the Inter-American Development Bank, and Michelle Bachelet, who is the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. This is part of our policy dialogue of the research department. This conversation will be in Spanish. There will be interpretation into English. Please send us your questions to paulc@iadb.org. So please go ahead, President Moreno. Thank you, and good morning. I wanted to begin by thanking President Michelle Bachelet very warmly. She has always worked closely with the Inter-American Development Bank. That goes way back. And those of you who are acquainted with the impressive track record of Michelle Bachelet, not only was she the first woman to be president of Chile, she's also a physician by profession. She has also been a leader in the area of gender, and right now she is High Commissioner for Human Rights in the United Nations. So we couldn't think of a person who was better suited to think about the effect of this pandemic on persons, on families in not only Latin America, but worldwide. And she really has a privileged vantage point. She is especially attuned to what is happening in the area of human rights. And this is a point where this pandemic has showcased many problems that we have in our cities: inequality, migration, exclusion, gender inequality. And as we have seen here in the United States just recently, racism and police brutality that has led to so many protests worldwide. So after that brief introduction, I will begin by calling on President Bachelet. I would like for her to tell us a bit about what she is currently seeing, and then we will begin our conversation. There are many people that follow her, that have questions for her. So President Bachelet, welcome. As always, it is a pleasure and an honor to have you here with us. Thank you, President Moreno. Hello, friends. I wanted to thank Luis Alberto Moreno, President of the Inter-American Development Bank, for his invitation to talk about the impact of COVID-19 in Latin America and the Caribbean. I applaud the efforts of the IDB and its president to support the country's ability to respond to COVID, the strengthening of social security networks, and opening a pathway towards economic recovery. I would like to recognize the different IDB initiatives to provide greater cooperation, including its support and the defense of human rights in terms of environmental and social policies. Now, this pandemic is the most serious health crisis that we have seen for decades, and it goes with economic and social impacts hand in hand, and our governments are trying to defend its population. Now, that is important in terms of leadership and humanity. Now, we have to look at the impact on the economies and lives. That impact has been catastrophic, but the marginalized, the peoples that are most exposed to violations of their human rights, are the worst off. So we say that the virus does not discriminate, but it does have an unequal impact, and this has uncovered major socioeconomic inequalities. And that means that we have two tasks. We have to overcome the epidemic, and we have to rebuild better. So right from the time when the crisis began, my office has been publishing guidance to deal with the pandemic. We have looked at different issues, but there's always a key issue, and that is that our response will only be effective if it revolves around the defense of human rights, because that is the case in the Americas. So the pandemic has affected violence against women. It has affected migration. people in the LGBT community. It has affected indigenous peoples. It has shown inequalities in the labor market, a lack of investment in public health, a lack of social justice, and barriers in terms of access to water, food, education, and other essential elements. So we need to have decisive, innovative action that covers everyone. Our priority has to defend human lives. The emergency measures that have been implemented to contain the pandemic have to protect the state of law. And of course, we have to take into account the devastating impacts on our economy. The impact of COVID-19 in local economies is yet to be felt in its full weight. However, we have seen that this pandemic is going to cause the greatest depression in economic activity in the region. The countries whose economy depend on tourism, on exports, including commodities, or manufacturing industries, are especially going to be affected. That, in comparison with last year, there will be an increase in the number of the unemployed, and 28.7 million, and in dire poverty. Now, these figures point to the challenges we faced. Now that in countries where we're always seeing low growth. And in several countries of the region, there had been people taking to the streets to protest because a lack of access to health and education. We detected last year 80 countries with important protests for these causes, but there is now greater demand because of a lack of food, water, medicine, or people disagree with the measures that have been enforced. Also, we see that the long food lines remind us that this is something that's not new for a lot of people. So we're not prepared for this social emergency. If we do not listen to the voices raised in protest, that will lead to greater fragmentation in the countries. So, friends, I think this pandemic is a risk for everyone, but the effects are disproportional on certain persons' livelihoods. Some people more vulnerable before the crisis are even more at risk. This COVID is affecting those who live in poverty. It worsens current inequalities, and it is leading to even greater poverty. Low-income countries are less able to respond effectively because of a weakness in their health and social systems because of the difficulty of doing social distancing there, and most population has no access to water or sanitation. As a result of COVID-19, millions of children have fallen into poverty as their families have financial difficulties because of disease, the impossibility of working, loss of household income, and other economic losses. In addition to the 386 million children living in extreme poverty, the, their lives will be affected. Also, children can no longer go to school because those schools have been closed down. Also, there's greater risk that these children will have to find jobs to help produce income for their families. This leads to forced labor amongst children, and in some cases also it can effect in many Latin American countries where women are working more in the informal sector with low salaries. Something like 40% of the women in the region work, and they're employed in areas that have been very affected. That it would be tourism, retail, businesses, trade, and girls have less access to the internet. That means that they cannot follow their schoolwork from home. Now, in Latin America, we already had high levels of femicide, and now we see that domestic violence has gone up because of the lockdown and because of distancing. Protection of migrants in Latin America is another source of concern, with deportations, closed borders, restrictive legislation. Some migrants are being sent home with no protection, including those that have had COVID in the country where they were. Now, the pandemic is creating discrimination worldwide, and there's discrimination against those who are suspected of having COVID-19. So we need to work together to reject these trends. The mindfulness campaigns, the information campaigns have to be fact-based. It is a need for access to information on the part of the public. Now, more than ever, governments have to be transparent, open, receptive, and open. And of the challenges reflected by COVID-19 in Latin America, they are serious. And there are promising practices that we see in the region. For example, to deal with the economic impact of the pandemic, the authorities in Costa Rica have taken measures to protect labor rights of women and reduce obligations for projects. They have to include women, migrants, indigenous population. In Bolivia, the government has a special license to protect the salaries of certain groups, including pregnant women or single-parent families. My office is supporting several responses in countries in the region. For example, providing technical support to civil society organizations, state agencies that work for the women that are deprived of freedom in El Salvador, or working with governments to facilitate access to information on healthcare in Panama. Also, a hashtag COVID-19 campaign in Guatemala, which provides a platform so as to provide awareness of the important role of women. Also, providing support for responses to the pandemic. We're working with a task force that was set up by Honduras to implement a national plan to guarantee economic and social rights, or to make certain that the multi-sectoral response of the Caribbean, in consultation with the governments, are going to continue to protect human rights. This is an example of the work that we have been doing. Now, once the pandemic is overcome, we have to build a better world. I appreciate what President Moreno said 2 weeks ago when he talked about a new social pact. I agree with the transformative impact of this crisis. Now, it's going to be key to have a universal floor of protection. In other words, some basic Social Security assuring access to basic education, health. We will have to recognize inequalities and also be willing to make the structural changes to correct them. Now, we have to respond to COVID-19 and give it political priority. This will not be easy, but we have to imagine a new social pact looking at the weaknesses that have been uncovered by the crisis. The stimulus package should facilitate our transition to a healthier, greener world, and it is possible to achieve these objectives if we're mindful of the interdependence amongst all of us and defend all of our rights. Now, the world needs to work in a way that is collaborative and coordinated. This global crisis requires a global response, and the pandemic shows us how important multilateral organizations are and how important it is to have equality of rights. So here, the IDB has a key role to play. So I hope we can continue to work together to create more sustainable and fair um, situations in the world. Thank you, President Bachelet. Let's begin. And of course, you have always encouraged us to work in this area. You gave some examples, but it's clear that the effect of this pandemic is especially harsh on the most vulnerable. And getting over the crisis depends on how we can include the vulnerable. Now, you spoke of women, and in your role as Commissioner for Women in the United Nations, What would you say about the progress that has been made in Latin America? You gave some examples, but how do you think we can think not only of better accommodating the realities of women right now, but especially we have to realize that women are a key player in economic recovery ahead? Well, the first thing is, and I was saying, the virus does not discriminate. It can infect all of us. That is the educated, the non-educated, the young, the old, but the effect is different because it isn't the same to be a professional where you live in a house where you can do social distancing and living in a very precarious area that's very crowded. It's not the same to have access to water and say, wash your hands, as having no access to water. Now, all women are not equal either. For example, a woman who is protected, this especially affects women for different reasons I'm going to give you, but it also affects the elderly. It affects people who have some disability. It affects people from the LGBT community because there can be a lack of medical care, for example, just to give you an example. It affects the people who are deprived of their liberty. They don't have the same protections. They're in crowded facilities. So if you're a woman, you're indigenous, you live in rural areas, you have no water, no sanitation, you're older. And since she's an elderly woman, she probably has no pension and no social protection. Or a large number of women work in the informal economy. And so this lockdown doesn't allow them to make a daily living. And often there is um, an overlapping of these different conditions. The women may be migrants. They may be internally displaced within their own country. And the truth is, you have to come up with policies to move ahead. And for that, we have to realize the important role played by women in society. I hope, Mr. President, I know that you have always been very open to gender issues, but I hope that when we applaud our support for health workers, something like 70% of healthcare workers are women. And note, in the 12 countries that best manage the pandemic, 7 are headed by women, either as a prime minister, as a president. So I hope that this will help transform the cultural perception of the role played by women. Since I'm a pediatrician by profession, I've always felt that our role is to talk about us being the weak sex, because when I would treat cases, I would always think that the girls would probably do better than the boys. So it's not true that we women are the weaker sex. So there has to be participation of our citizens in making this response. The problem isn't, this cannot only be women. These have to be communities analyzing their own problems and finding their own solutions. But as we were saying, we also have to devise responses, but based on the intersectorality, which causes the situation to be especially dramatic for them. Another problem we see in the region, but also that we see throughout the world, is gender violence. And that goes hand in hand with the fact that many women spend the whole day with their abusers. They're locked down with them. Now, some people have felt that the services that support the victims of violence have been limited because they're closed, or other uh, legal processes have been brought to a halt. But In other areas, people have come up with a code. For example, women can go to a pharmacy and say, I need a red mask, and that triggers an immediate response. That means that they are at risk, but there has been an increase in the cases of violence being reported against both women and girls. So I think that we do have to have a gender perspective, responses, a vaccine. The vaccine will probably be exactly the same, but the complexities of the vaccine mean that you don't know, because as we're saying, this pandemic affects everyone, but more men than women die. Now, I'm not acquainted with the most recent evidence, but it seems that men have an enzyme that would make it more attractive to virus. And others say that there are different applications where we can get a better response because women may be more resilient to the virus. Bottom line is, no one knows. But the fact is, more males than females do die as a result of COVID. But we don't know if a vaccine can be administered in the same dose to everyone, children, adults. We know that children fall sick less. Perhaps the virus load is lower, but other children are asymptomatic and do just fine. But other children have an immunological response, and there is a general inflammation, something similar to Kawasaki disease. So the question is, children, if they have this immunological reaction, are we going to need the same vaccination, the same vaccine for boys and girls? So there are a lot of questions that are as of yet unanswered, but the truth is the answer is going to not be 100% straightforward. Thank you very much, Madam President. I wanted to go back. I remember that you lived through the international financial crisis. And I remember talking to you back then. This was an event that was held in Chile, and the whole idea was to come up with exit strategies. And when you think back to that time and that experience and what you're seeing now, what were the things that you did right in Chile? What allowed Chile to pull through that crisis and continue to do well? Well, I think that Chile, and this has to do with a very good decision made by my predecessor, President Lago, when he said that he wanted to apply the Norwegian model, putting money aside, a rainy day fund. Now, the Bible talks about the fat and the lean cows. And so we had surplus resources, unfortunately coming from copper. But with those resources, we were able to set money aside for a rainy day fund. In other words, to offset the effect of the economy. So we did have that buffer, which made it easier than for other countries that did not have any funds set aside, but we had been saving these monies, and that made it easier for us. Also, we had a very comprehensive package. Now, I can't remember the technical details, it was so long ago, but we did come up with a formula. But there is something, and I'm sure that these were very capable people. They did have gender considerations. So since we were trying to create jobs, we had to do things that were shovel ready. We looked at what sectors had been affected and see how we could support them. We knew, for example, for the tourism industry that had been so affected, we would do programs during the whole year with the elderly, with children, so that they could make good use of those facilities without limiting their use just to the summer months. So also we were looking at how we could provide support for small and medium-sized industries so as to help them overcome the crisis. The most complex problem is going to be in those countries where there's no fiscal space. Now, you can always create that space if there's the political will, but right now is not the best time to be doing this. Now, I hope I don't take you aback by what I'm going to say, but it's not a good time right now to have zero debt. It is not the point right now to balance our budget, nor should we be spending wildly and thus create a disaster. No, but this is a time to realize that, well, first of all, we have to reassess our priorities. We have to redefine them. And we have to channel resources in other directions. We have to cut back in some areas that may not be all that crucial, and then perhaps those resources can go into social areas, job creation. And I give those two examples thinking that that would be well advised. Also, I imagine that we would have to look at infrastructure projects that can create a lot of jobs. And another thing, Mr. President, and I really don't have a concrete answer to everything, but what we see is that 60% of emerging diseases are zoonosis. That means these are diseases transmitted to humans from animals, and a lot of them are wild animals because we have not respected biodiversity. We have intervened in nature. So SARS, MERS that came from camels, Ebola, all of these are zoonosis, as is coronavirus. So we have to think of a greener economy, a circular economy, an inclusive one, and that is why we need these social measures to be taken, and also something that will respect the climate.
We have a number of questions that are sent to us by the hearers. Some say the excessive burden of housework on women can truly affect their productivity in the labor market at a time of social distancing. How can we mitigate these negative effects to prevent a widening of the gaps? And can this be considered within recovery? Do you think it's priority, for instance, to incorporate primary education into recovery? No doubt. And I wouldn't even focus only on primary education. I would say even from early childhood learning. One of the initiatives we're looking at, and it's not as a response to the crisis, because I am absolutely convinced that early care of children generates the conditions for them to fully develop their skills. So early childhood education, I think, is crucial. And that is why we have built so many kindergartens, so that all children would have the potential to develop their skills, and parents would be able to work, both mothers and fathers, knowing that the children were being cared for. So it's necessary to make it possible for women to be able to contribute with their work and also have income for the household. It's important to have areas that can provide good care to children. And women in Latin America are responsible for the children and for the grandparents also, and that means that they cannot go out to work. They have caring for their very own mothers. So you need to generate some basic conditions allowing women to then be able to join the labor market allowing them to contribute to development. But they need to have these opportunities, otherwise, it becomes impossible for
y
them.
es lo que yo creo que ha funcionado en la mayoría de los
And that, I
países.
think, is what has truly worked in
Otra
many
pregunta para seguir
countries.
justamente
There's
sobre estos
another
temas,
question
Valeria,
here,
los que
also
mencionaba
speaking
anteriormente,
about
aquella
gender and
pregunta es,
something that you mentioned
en
earlier.
el
The
sector de
question
salud, pues
says,
hay
in the health
miles de millones de
sector,
mujeres
there are
trabajadoras
thousands of
en
women
ese
who are
sector y sin
working
embargo
in this
hay
sector.
todavía enormes
However,
diferencias
there are
salariales
still
entre hombres y
enormous
mujeres.
income
¿Cómo cree que
differences
se
between
debería
men and
plantear, llevar
women.
esta discusión para
How
que
do
haya
you
más
think this
accesibilidad?
discussion should be viewed in order to achieve greater equality?
Sí, la verdad es que es
Well, quite
curioso que
honestly,
hay áreas donde, o sea,
it's interesting to
esta
see
diferencia es más fuerte en lo
that
profesional,
the
¿ya?
areas is
Y depende además
there are
de la
areas
situación.
where
En el
there
sector
is
público
a
muchas
greater
veces
difference amongst
hay una
professionals. It
diferencia de
also
razón,
depends
uno
of
entra al
sectors
grado
because
X
you've
y da
got a
lo mismo si
different
hombre y mujer
skill
tienen el mismo salario,
level and
pero
don't
seguramente
have
donde tienen que
salary
negociarse las condiciones
equivalence. But
salariales
it's
es
necessary
donde
to
muchas
negotiate
veces
the
hay
salary
diferencias
conditions.
importantes entre los
And
hombres y
that's
las
where we
mujeres.
see many
Y yo me
differences
pregunté
between men
mucho
and
eso
women.
y
And I've
yo
often wondered about this.
planteé que era necesario a lo
And I
mejor
have said it was
introducirlo
necessary
en las
perhaps to
constituciones, ¿no?
introduce
En
it
las
in the
constituciones de que
constitutions of the
hubiera
countries.
a igual trabajo,
The
igual salario,
constitution should
porque
state
la verdad es
equal
que
salary
era
for
más
equal work
o porque hay prejuicio, o porque
because it
hay,
could be due to
en algunos
prejudice,
casos es porque
and
las
in some
mujeres
cases
también
it's because
tienen un
women
grado de formación distinta a
also
los
have a
60 años
different
de
level of
trabajo.
training.
Hace
There are
cosas que
certain
también hacen
areas
que las
of
pongan más
work
cercanas al cuidado,
where
¿ya?
that are more focused
Y hay
on
pocas
care, perhaps,
matemáticas,
but don't
física,
focus much
y
on
yo creo
math,
que ese
on
elemento
physics,
también para
etc.
que las
So that
mujeres
is yet
salgan,
another reason
revisar de
why
qué manera se
women are in
articula
this
eso más allá
situation.
del
So
dos
we need to
programas
see how
esenciales
to
que son
better
la mujer
stimulate
de ciencia,
women in
matemáticas, en
science,
tecnología, ¿verdad?
mathematics,
Ingeniería,
technology, and
y hacer que
engineering,
puedan desarrollar todas sus competencias,
areas
porque
that
si
will
no,
allow them to fully
finalmente muchas
develop
veces
their
esas mujeres
skills,
terminan
because
muy
otherwise
atrasadas
women
en áreas de trabajo
frequently
que
are,
tienen
need
salarios
to
más bajos.
focus on
Distinto es
work
saber
areas that receive
igual
lower
trabajo,
salaries.
igual
We
función,
need
eso
to
sí debería tener
understand that
igual
for the
salario.
same position, there needs to be
Muchas gracias,
the
Presidencia.
same salary.
Una pregunta que
Thank you,
precisamente
President.
es cómo incidir
There's
en
another
gobiernos
question
que no
here. How to
quieren
impact
adoptar
governments who do not
el
wish
nuevo
to
contrato
adopt
sobre la
the
economía
new
verde?
contract on green economy?
Yo creo que yo eso también me lo pregunté muchas
That's
veces,
another thing I've pondered
porque uno en general lo que le
frequently.
pasa a los gobiernos
Generally, what
cuando
we see in
calculan
government
con lo que les
is
va a costar
when
hacer
they calculate the cost
ciertas determinadas acciones,
of
optan por
certain
no hacerlas porque
actions,
son muy
then they
costosas.
decide to not do them because they're too
Eh,
expensive.
yo siempre les planteaba,
But
han hecho el cálculo
there
de
has been a
cuánto va a
calculation
costar el no hacer lo que
as
habría que hacer
to the
con respecto al
cost
cambio
of not
climático?
doing what
Y las
should be
estimaciones
done.
son
And the
bastante dramáticas, porque
estimates
si bien
are
es
quite
cierto que a lo mejor en el
dramatic.
corto
It's
plazo
true that in the short
el
term,
costo de inversión en
the
determinadas
investment
formas de
cost
economías verdes
in
puede ser
certain
alto,
types of green
pero en
economy
mediano
might
y en
be
largo
high,
plazo el
but in
costo
the
de no hacerlo
medium
es mucho
and
mayor,
long
¿no?
term, the cost
Nosotros
of not
empezamos a
doing will be
conversar
far
con
higher. We have started
el
to have
Banco Mundial
conversations with the
de poder
World
empezar a
Bank
hacer estas
to
estimaciones,
try
¿no?
and
Porque
prepare these
lo mismo
calculations and
que
estimates.
con cualquiera de estas cosas, cualquier programa social. Si
And
el
this
gobierno no
goes
ve
for
el
any
costo de
social
hacerlo,
program. If you look merely at the
uno le
cost of
exige
doing
menos.
it,
Es
or
lo mismo que
even
usted
gender
sabe,
issues, but the
cuando usted
final
tiene una
cost,
persona que es
when you
herida o
have a person
muerta,
who is injured
áreas
or who
destruidas,
dies
ahí el
or
costo es
destroyed
menor y se hace
family,
más
then the
fácil
cost
prevenir.
becomes
Y el
enormous.
caso
So
de la
it's best
economía
to
verde es lo
have
mismo que ocurre en
preventive
términos
actions.
haciendo. Ahora,
With the green
te
economy,
cuento
it's
nosotros
exactly
qué
the
hicimos
same
en mi país, que
situation.
decidimos
For instance, what
desarrollar,
did we
digamos,
do in
una
my
línea energética
country?
muy
We had
sucia,
a very dirty
muy
energy
dependiente del
matrix,
carbón, y
highly carbon
decidimos
dependent,
desarrollar una
and we
matriz
decided to develop
energética
an
de energías
energy
renovables
matrix with
enorme,
renewable energy.
grande, y
It
la
was an
verdad es
enormous
que no solo
project.
logramos
And
transformar
not
la matriz
only were we
energética de
able
Chile,
to
sino más
transform the
logramos
grid in
hacerla más
Chile,
barata.
but we were
Y
also
sí,
able
entonces
to reduce
hay
the price
elementos
of
que a veces ese
electricity.
costo a
So
mediano
there are some
parece que es mucho
elements
más caro,
that,
pero al
if you
final
look in the short
rinde
term,
mucho
looks
más.
expensive, but
Y
when
yo
you
creo
look
que
at
hay que
it over the
conjuntar esos
long term,
ejemplos. Yo
then
creo que
it's
Chile
very
puede ser un buen ejemplo para gobierno,
wise.
porque por distintos
So
gobiernos
it's worth doing it.
tomaron
Different
medidas
governments in Chile
de
adopted
economía
different
más verde,
measures to lead
no
us
completamente,
towards
pero
a
más verde.
greener economy, not a
Y
fully
creo que
green
también
economy, but at
donde
least
hay que seguir
greener.
apuntando
But
también
we
es
also
a una
need to
economía más
continue
azul, ¿no? Nadie
focusing
sabe muy
on
bien la
a
definición de
economy
economía
that is
azul,
more blue.
pero lo que
Nobody
podemos
can define
considerar
what a blue
es
economy is,
que
but
tiene
those
un punto
who
de
know
diferenciación
about it understand that it has great potential, for instance, in tourism, in energy, There are a number of processes to identify what elements can be found that are profitable in the oceans. So there are 8 or 10 categories, areas where it is possible to develop, and these are truly interesting for the economies of a country. We have another question here. What will Latin America have to do to gradually pull out of the quarantine, reactivating the economies, and what will be needed
A
for
ver,
the
lo primero
world
que
to
yo,
return to normalcy?
yo creo que aquí no hay una receta única,
I don't think there's a single
pero parece que
recipe
tiene que
here,
haber respuestas
but we
coordinadas,
do
¿ah?
need coordinated responses.
Porque si no, el riesgo es
Otherwise,
que si usted abre muy
the
rápido,
risk is if you open
puede
up a
haber un
country
rebote,
too fast, you
pasó
can
en
have
Japón,
a
pasó en Corea y pasó en
outbreak.
Singapur.
We
En
have
Singapur,
seen this
claro,
in
se
Japan,
controló muy
Korea,
bien
and
los
Singapore. In
infectados, los
Singapore,
infectados vivían en
things were
otro
done
piso
very well,
cerrado y
but
ahí
migrants who
se
were
concentra
living
el virus. En
in
Japón, una isla, lo
overpopulated
mismo, y en Corea también.
dormitories, then they
Entonces,
saw a
yo
resurgence
creo que
of the
lo primero
outbreak.
es que
The
esto
same
tiene que
in
estar
Japan
basado
and
en la
Korea.
ciencia, vale decir,
So
lo
first,
que los
what we need to
científicos
focus on is
la
science.
OMS, la
The
OPS,
professionals,
recomienden
World Health
lo que
Organization,
ellos
and other
prevé. Después
organizations, we
empezó
need
a
to
abrir
see
y
what they are
empezaron a ver
recommending.
por algunos,
So they
algunos
started with some
tiendas, la gente
recommendations,
pudo ir a
opening up
restaurantes, pero no empezó
slowly, open
por
some
meses.
types of shops and
Y
then
ahora
some
ya
restaurants, but
decretaron,
with fewer
hasta
patrons,
ahorita las
with
restricciones
social
leves, o
distancing.
no
Now,
todas, pero varias.
restrictions are
Lo que se
gradually
puede hacer
being
conciertos,
removed,
grandes
but
eventos.
not all of them, obviously. You
Entonces,
can't have
claro,
concerts or that kind of event for the
la
time being.
economía se requiere reactivar,
In
pero hay que hacerlo de una
economy, you
manera
need to
tal de
have
que no
some
se genere
reactivation, but do it
economics a
in
cualquier
such a
mercado.
way that you
Ahora,
don't
¿cuánto
have a
puede demorar la
resurgence of the
verdad?
disease. Now,
Primero,
how
nadie
long will it
sabe,
take? Well, quite
honestamente,
honestly,
nadie
nobody
sabe
knows it,
si en
quite
enero va a haber
honestly.
vacunas o no va a haber
In
vacunas.
January,
Hemos
will we have a
estado
vaccine or
prometiendo
not?
en Estados
We've
Unidos.
heard promises
La
from
segunda
the
pregunta
United
es,
States,
¿qué
for
se vacuna
instance.
primero?
Then the
Y
second
pareciera
question
ser
is who
que la
should be
respuesta
vaccinated first?
honesta y
The
adecuada debería ser
honest
los trabajadores de la salud, o sea, los que están en la primera línea.
response should be
Por
the
tanto,
frontline
son
workers, the health
especialistas,
workers, for
toda la gente que
instance,
está
and
en primera
cleaning
línea.
crews. Everybody who's on the front
Lo
line should get
tercero
it
es,
first. The
como
third
decía, no se sabe
issue
si el virus muta o no
is we
muta y si
don't know
esas
if there's a
vacunas
mutation in
disponibles,
the
porque hay que
virus,
pensar en
and
una
the
vacuna
vaccine, should one be found,
sanas, o sea,
will it
segura,
be a
adecuada
safe
para
todos,
todos,
will it be
etcétera.
suitable for
No
everyone,
sabemos si muta como
etc.
la
But
influenza
then
y por lo
we don't
tanto
know if
cada
there are
año
going to
hay que
be
tener nuevas
mutations, such
vacunas.
as in the case of influenza, so every year you need a
La
new
más
vaccine.
compleja situación, yo
The
creo,
next
es
situation
cómo
that is even
asegurar
more
que se
complex is
vacunen
how
a
to
todo el mundo,
ensure
los 7
that
millones de
everybody
personas,
is
porque la
vaccinated,
verdad
the
es que
7
si fuera
billion
estacional,
people. If it
entonces va a
were
volver acá en
seasonal,
invierno de
then
acá y
it's going to
luego
come
en el
back in
norte y
winter
va a llegar
here, then in
en
the
sur.
southern hemisphere, then in
Es
the
como
northern
estamos definiendo
hemisphere. So, how can
¿cómo se
you
llaman estos cierres de confinamiento?
deal
Bueno,
with
esta,
these
digamos,
lockdowns,
es una
the
parte real y
confinement
la
or
otra parte
quarantines
van a
in
estar
one
las
part of the
respuestas ahí.
world
Entonces, la verdad es
and
que es un
not in the other
tema
part of the world? So it's
no se sabe
extremely
mucho
complex.
y por lo
There's still a
tanto
lot
hay
to
gente
be
que
learned,
dice
and there are people
probablemente ante
who
2 años
say
difícil,
that it's probably
porque,
unlikely to
porque no
occur
sabemos
in the
nada
next
todavía.
few
Primero no
years
sabemos si vamos a
because
conseguir
we don't know
poder
anything
sacar
yet.
efecto,
We don't even know if
si
we're
vamos
going
a
to
poder
have the
ganar.
right
Entonces,
vaccine in
hay una
time.
discusión muy interesante hoy
There's a
día y
very
el secretario
interesting
general llamó
discussion between,
a
and the
Suiza
Secretary
cuando
General
se hizo la asamblea de la OMS a que las vacunas
made
deben
a call
desarrollarse
when
cuando
the
haya la vacuna.
WHO
Ahora
had
ya
its
hubo un
assembly when
viento
talking about the vaccine that it should be considered
digamos,
as a public good.
si hay algo que mostraba la pandemia,
Because
no solo las
there is
desigualdades,
something we've seen in the pandemic,
sino
it's
que
not
acá
only
nadie
the
se sabe, no solamente
inequalities
uno,
that
y que lo
exist,
mejor que me puede
but that
pasar a
nobody
mí
is
y que
safe.
otras personas estén
What
sanas
can
sea
best
sana,
happen to
¿no?
me, the best thing for me
Y
is
aquí
for
no pasa
everybody
nada,
around me to also be
porque
healthy. And
como
that's
decía
what
una
makes it
señora
so
que yo veía en la
complex.
televisión, el ideal
I
podría
saw
ser
a
hacer una
woman on
vacuna que
the
sea oral,
television
que no requiera
saying
entrar en
that
el
it would be
frío,
good
para que
if we
pueda
could
tener
have a
todas las
vaccine that
precauciones de
could
las
be
vacunas.
administered orally,
Eso
didn't
no
need a
sabemos lo que va a
cold
pasar.
chain,
Entonces yo creo
etc.
que hay
But
que
we actually
prepararse
don't
para
know what
largo,
kind of a
para
vaccine
largo
we're
rato.
going to have. So we have to be
Y
prepared for a very
seguramente
long period of
algunas
time, a
cosas vamos a
long
tener que
term.
cambiar.
And I think some things will
El
have to
distanciamiento
change.
físico va a haber que
Physical
mantenerlo.
distancing will have to
El
be
lavado,
extended,
el lavado frecuente de manos también, pero hay que
frequent
hacer
hand
distanciamiento
washing
para la gente
also.
que...
But for that, we
Creo que
need to
leí
provide
que son
water to
61 millones de
people.
personas en la región que
There
tienen agua
are
potable.
81 million people in the region without
Entonces,
clean water.
estamos diciendo lavarse las
Yes,
manos,
that's
no,
true.
no tiene
So we're
agua
telling
potable.
people, wash your
Y
hands,
muchas
but they
cosas
don't
que
have
hay que
water to
activar.
do it.
Es cierto.
So there are
Hay
lots
gente
and
que
lots
dice,
of
¿por dónde
things we
empiezo
have to
aquí?
do about,
Porque
and
son
many
tantas las
people
cosas que hay que
wonder
hacer.
where should we start because there's so
Lamentablemente,
much to be
como
done.
son tantos los factores,
unfortunately,
hay
because of there being so many
poquito
factors, We just have
Así es,
to
presidenta, y justamente
have some
sobre el tema que
priorities.
usted le ha dedicado tanto tiempo y
Yes,
es el de la
there's a
educación.
topic that
Aquí
you
la
have
pregunta es, ¿cómo
spent much
ayudar a
time
países
on,
que
and it's
tienen
education. And
educación
the
con altos
question is
niveles de analfabetismo,
how,
caso
in
por
some
ejemplo
countries
Guatemala,
with high levels
donde
of
muchos niños no
illiteracy,
tienen
such as
acceso
Guatemala, where
específicamente a los hechos
children
sobre sus
don't
cabezas
have
en las
access
escuelas
to a
y
schoolroom or
menos
even a roof in
acceso a
their
educación
classes,
virtual
or
o incluso
even less
muchas
access
veces
to
a
virtual
racionamiento.
education, and very
¿Cómo hacer para
frequently
que la
don't
brecha en
even have
educación no se
water and
haga más grande y la
sanitation? How can we
desigualdad?
ensure that the
Bueno,
education
yo creo
gap
que hay que
doesn't
hacer,
become
hay
even
que ver.
greater?
Yo creo que a ver, yo personalmente creo que
Personally, I
los
believe
países tienen que tomar
that
prioridades
countries need to establish
lo
their
social tiene que ser
priorities,
una prioridad.
and social issues have to become a
En ese
priority.
sentido hay que invertir en educación.
It's necessary to
Hay
invest
que
in
invertir en
education.
educación y también
Invest in
definir de qué
education
manera,
while at the same time
con apoyos, y yo
seeing
sé que
how,
no
with
sé si hoy día
support,
lo están
for
haciendo, pero
instance,
sé
and
que
I
hay
don't know
una
if
de
the
las
IDB
uno de los
is doing this,
lineamientos
but it's
del
one of
Banco Mundial,
the
por lo que decía hace
guidelines
días
for
la
the
Carolina,
World Bank.
es apoyar la tecnología,
And I'm talking
la
about
parte
support for
digital.
technology, the
Efectivamente,
digital world,
hay muchos
because
niños y niñas que no
indeed
tienen
there are
acceso
many
a
children
Internet.
who do not have
Entonces,
internet
uno de
access.
los objetivos es,
So
llamémosle
one
Internet para todos,
objective
cómo
should be
iluminamos al
internet for
mundo.
all,
Y yo creo que esto es
how we
clave.
can deploy it
Lamentablemente
throughout the
vamos
world.
a
And this is
poder tener que
crucial
enfrentar situaciones como
because
esta,
we're
de las
going
cuales
to
no
have to
estábamos preparados. Mi
confront
país es más
situations
poderoso que
like
el mundo.
this, and nobody is really prepared for it
Y yo creo que invertir
at
en
first.
escuelas,
And therefore,
así
investing
como
in
invertir en atención
schools,
primaria,
investing
¿no?
in primary
En la
care,
educación primaria, en la
also
atención
in
primaria
primary
son
education,
inversiones
primary
que
care, these
necesitan
are
hacer,
investments that countries must
y que donde también se
take.
pueden buscar esfuerzos público-privados
We can
también, ¿ah?
also look for
Entendiendo
public
de que
private
lo importante que
efforts,
tiene cada país es rescatar
understanding that
esfuerzos que
the
son
human
sobrehumanos en
capital
algunas
is what is
circunstancias.
most important to any country.
No, y justamente en eso, presidenta, nosotros
Yes, President, it's
básicamente una de las áreas
precisely
que nos hemos dedicado es a todos estos temas de tecnología y
because one of
justamente
the areas,
incorporando
technology,
todos
that
los procesos de
here the
innovación en el
IDB has
trabajo que hacemos, sino
deemed so
ayudándole a los
important.
países
We're
a
incorporating
extender
it
la
in our
banda ancha, que es
processes and
precisamente
helping countries
la ruta
expand
desde donde se
broadband, because
suele
this
generar todos
is
estos procesos
the
digitales. Y justamente
means
sobre eso,
of finding a
la
solution
pregunta
to
aquí
the
es,
digital
se ha visto un
conundrum.
gran despliegue de
There
apps
has been
de
a great
tecnología para
deployment of apps
trazabilidad de
and
virus. Algo que
technology
parece
to
ser
trace the
esencial a su
virus,
control.
something that
¿Cómo
seems
ve
to
usted
be
este
crucial
fenómeno
for
en materia de
control.
derechos humanos?
How do you
Y si
view
sí es
this
posible que
phenomenon
con la
as
toma de
under
tanta
human
información
rights, and
personal,
how,
esta
with the
sesión nos
capture
pueda
of so
ayudar a
much personal
a
information,
esa
could this be
estigmatización más
a
adelante?
door to having
A ver, hay dos cosas
greater
que son
stigmatization in the
esenciales
future?
que hay que
Well, there are two
diferenciar.
crucial
Una
elements here. We need to establish a
que
difference
parte
between them.
clave de cómo
First
se
of all,
responde a la pandemia es
the
detectando casos,
response to
¿cierto?
pandemic is
Y
through the
detectando los
detection of
contactos,
cases
¿no?
and also
Para
tracing their
poder colocarlos
contact
en
in order
cuarentena,
to place people in
informarles, etc.
quarantine
Y
and
tomar medidas
provide them with
preventivas.
information and take the necessary
Es verdad,
protective
entonces,
measures.
en muchos
That's
lugares se ha
recognized.
estado concentrando información
A lot of
justamente de casos de
information has
contacto,
been
pero ese tipo
concentrated
de
in
medidas
areas such as the
excepcionales
contact.
que yo decía
But
tienen que
just like
ser
exceptional measures, which,
solamente
as
las
I
que
pointed
respondan a
out,
la necesidad
should only
específica
be those
por
that
el tiempo
respond
que
to the
corresponda también. Lo
emergency
mismo pasa acá.
and the
Esa
time for it.
información,
And the same
por decir
happens
así,
here.
siempre
That
debe no
information
almacenarse, ¿no?
should not be stored
Porque no
afterwards
se use en contra de las personas.
to
Nosotros
ensure
hemos
that it
visto,
cannot be used
obviamente,
against
que en
people,
algunos
because we
casos
have indeed
hay
seen in
países
some
donde
cases
alguna de estas medidas
there are countries
excepcionales
where these
los han
exceptional
transformado casi
measures
como en
have
una normalidad,
become
¿no?
the
Hay países
normal
donde
measures. There are countries
empiezan por ejemplo, a tratar los presidentes
that where
de
presidents
gobernar por decreto,
try
¿no?
to
Sin
govern
tener que
by
ir a parlamento,
decree
¿no?
without
Entonces,
having to go
hay
before
disposiciones, así
parliament
es la
or
constitución,
Congress.
en la mayoría de los países
The
se fija esa
constitutions of
variación.
countries do
Entonces, nosotros tenemos
define
información
what
de que
an
el
emergency
exceso de
situation is.
información
And
sobre las personas puede
it-
ser mal utilizado, claro, nosotros vemos y en
there
las
is no
regiones
doubt
donde
that
está
an excess of
lamentablemente
information can
esto
be
demasiado
misused by
escaso,
people.
de
In the
defensores de
region, there
derechos
are too many
humanos, líderes
cases of
sociales,
human rights
líderes
defenders
indígenas,
and
gente que
advocates,
trabaja por la
leaders
tierra,
of
por el
the
agua,
indigenous
han
people,
sido
people
asesinados,
working for
¿no?
water, for land. They have
Entonces,
been murdered.
se puede usar, mal usar. O sea,
So the
la
information can
información, la
be
tecnología no es
misused.
buena o mala.
Information
Es
and
la gente que toma
technology is
decisiones
not
en la
good
que
or bad. It's the
puede hacerlo
people
bien
who
o hacerlo mal.
make the
Entonces, yo
decisions,
creo que
the
tiene
governments.
riesgo
They
y
are the
nosotros
ones
lo
who
tenemos que hacer
define good
precisamente
from evil.
porque hemos visto que en muchos
We
países,
have seen
por ejemplo,
that in many
con
countries
esta medida de emergencia,
with these
uno puede
emergency
limitar
measures,
ciertos derechos.
one can limit
en la Ley
certain rights.
Internacional de Derechos Humanos
The
señala
international human
que
rights
hay unas
law
situaciones como esta
indicates
donde
that
uno
in
puede limitar
situations
ciertos
such as
derechos,
this,
el
you
derecho de
can
asamblea, o sea, de
limitate such
movilizarse, ¿no es verdad?
some
El derecho a
rights,
movilidad,
such as the right
pero no
to
puede
assemblies
limitar
and
el
to meetings,
derecho
but you
de
cannot
expresión,
impact
no
the
debe
freedom of expression. You
limitar a la prensa, por
should not
supuesto, por el
limit
contrario,
the
es
press.
necesaria como una
Quite on the
medida de salud
contrary, because
pública,
it
que la gente
isn't
tenga que
necessary. It
informarse, poder
is
decir su nota,
important from a public
que pueda
health
participar.
standpoint for people to
Entonces,
be
claro,
informed
hay
and
gente que
able to
aprovecha
participate.
de
But there
esto,
are
o sea,
people
por
who
ejemplo,
take
nosotros hace una
advantage
semana
of it.
mandamos
For instance, we
sacamos una guía
issued
sobre riesgos de personas
guidelines
privadas de
on risk
libertad
for people deprived
en
of
prisión.
freedom.
Porque
In
sabemos
other
que las
words,
prisiones
people
están
who are in
continuamente
prisons, because we
sobrepasadas.
know that
Y entonces sugeríamos
prisons are
que las
overcrowded.
personas que fueran
And we were
liberadas, primero,
suggested
cuidado
that,
del régimen de
well,
prisión
first of all,
preventivo
that there
o
not to be
justificado.
preventive
Segundo, que, por ejemplo, las
incarceration,
personas que estén
avoid
bajo
that.
riesgo de
Second,
cumplir
people
condena
who
puedan
were
ser liberados.
close to
O
the
las
end
mujeres
of the
embarazadas
sentence,
o los
that they
niños.
be
Y por
released.
supuesto,
And
con menores de
also,
edad, no con
women
menores
who
de
were
capital.
pregnant or had their
Pero
children,
ahí
they be
seguimos
released,
tratando
obviously with
de
minor
crear una
crimes, not with
genocidas,
the
¿no? O
major
sea, porque,
crimes,
bueno, el amigo del
not
proceso.
a
Entonces, claro,
femicide
pueden usar también inadecuadamente ese
perpetrator,
instrumento,
for instance.
pero la verdad es
So there
que,
are
es
instruments that can
que
be used.
eso, nosotros explícitamente en la guía decimos,
But
no,
explicitly in our
no,
guide,
eso no, la gente que puede ser
we do
peligrosa,
say that you
genocida,
should not
con
release
crímenes contra la
dangerous
humanidad,
people,
etcétera, etcétera.
people who will
Yo
commit
creo
crimes against humanity, etc., etc. Those
yo
people
creo que
are not
eso hace
suitable for
que,
release.
o sea, siempre que hay como estos estados, situaciones cautelares, hay
So
riesgo de que los derechos humanos
there's
no sean
always a
efectivamente
risk
respetados.
of
Y a
violating
veces
human rights
incluso
with these
tratando de hacerlo
precautionary
bien, porque por
measures,
ejemplo la
even
gente
when trying to do
cerrada
it
el toque
well,
de queda
because people who didn't
lleva muchos
obey
hijos.
curfew are
Pero hay
taken
prisiones
to
donde no
jail,
quedan
but
sociodependientes, entonces
they are taken to
el riesgo de una
overcrowded
infección mayor
prisons.
es mayor. Entonces,
So the risk of
decisiones que
infection
hay
is
que
far
balancearlas
greater.
con mucho
These are
cuidado,
decisions that you need
porque
to
todas
strike a
esas
balance
decisiones
very
pueden costar un
carefully.
tiempo, como
Any
por ejemplo
decision
decir que una
seeking
persona
to be
mujer no
good,
debe salir
they
durante
know you shouldn't go
el toque
out
de queda.
during a
Hay
curfew,
que saber cuáles pueden ser las
but
razones y mirar
you
cuáles
need to
pueden ser las
know
respuestas más adecuadas a eso.
which is the right
Pero yo no estoy
answer to
diciendo
the
que
right
no haya que
kind of
respetar el
person.
toque de queda, hay
I'm
que
not
respetarlo.
saying that you shouldn't obey a
Sin
curfew.
duda,
Quite on the contrary, a curfew
presidenta,
has to
aquí
be
otra,
abided by. Yes,
otra
undoubtedly.
pregunta.
Here we
Dice,
have
en la
another
región con
question for you.
anterioridad
In
al
the region
COVID-19 se
prior
observaron
to
muchas manifestaciones
COVID-19, there
por
were
demandas
many
sociales no atendidas
demonstrations for
y pocos
social
de
demands
crear
that
COVID.
hadn't been
Seguramente estas
responded to.
demandas
And
seguirán en
after
aumento
COVID, these
por los
requests and
efectos
demands are
sociales y
going to
económicos que se
increase
están dando.
with
En
the
este
given the
contexto se
social and
observa un
economic
desencanto por
impact.
las instituciones
There is
democráticas. ¿Qué se puede hacer para
the
fortalecer justamente
non-satisfaction with
esas instituciones?
the institutions. What can be done
Bueno,
to
sí, yo le
strengthen
decía
them?
adelante que en el mundo hubo 80
In
países
the
con la
world, there are
gente
80
protestando.
countries with
Algunos
people
era por razones
demonstrating in the
económicas, otros
streets, some
sociales,
for
otros políticas.
economic reasons, others
Pero lo
social,
interesante es que
others
partiera
political
por la causa y que
reasons.
partiera
But
luego ese
whatever the cause
desperdigado
may
conjunto de
be,
otras demandas.
then it extended
Lo
to yet other
interesante y
demands.
curioso
Another
era que no
interesting
era la
fact
gente más pobre la que
is
estaba en la
that
calle,
it
eran
wasn't the
muchos
poor
otros
people
jóvenes,
who were out on the streets
profesionales, jóvenes
demonstrating.
estudiantes, ¿no es
There were
verdad?
young
La
professionals,
gran mayoría de ellas
students.
de manera
Most
pacífica.
of them were
Pero
demonstrating
muchas veces,
peacefully. But
lamentablemente, en
very
muchos de los países
frequently
se
and
volvió medida
unfortunately, the
represiva
response by the
e hizo
countries
que
was
la violencia viniera más
repressive,
violencia,
and
¿no?
violence generates more
Entonces,
violence.
yo creo que sí. Yo veo también como un elemento de riesgo. Además,
Another risk
va a haber
element
varias elecciones este año,
is the fact that
¿no?
there will be a
Elecciones
number
presidenciales,
of elections this year, whether
Yo
they are
veo
presidential or
riesgos efectivos
parliamentary
dependiendo
elections.
de cómo maneje
So,
la
depending
pandemia cada
on
gobierno.
how the
Algunos
government
pueden ser más
manages the
exitosos,
pandemic. Some will be more
lamentablemente
successful,
ocurrió
other
mismo
less.
desde
But
casa como se ha
unfortunately,
hecho
we have
una
seen a
negación,
number of
¿no? A
cases
la
where
elección,
there has been
y la
absolute
negación
denial
además
of the
fuertemente,
infection, and the
y con
infection
muchos
has
muertos
spiked
también.
enormously,
Entonces,
resulting
va a
in a
depender
high
mucho
level of death.
cada
So it
gobierno, la
depends on how
situación,
the government
la capacidad
manages
del
the
sistema de salud para
situation,
responder,
the
pero también
capacity of the
puede
health
desatar
systems to
consecuencias
respond,
sociales y
but
económicas.
also the devastating
Pero
social and
también va a
economic
depender de nuevo si los
impact. But
gobiernos
once
tienen
again, it will
programas
depend
sociales y
on whether
económicos
the
efectivos de
governments
tipo
have
social que
social
permitan
programs and
de alguna
economic
manera hacerse cargo de
programs
esto.
that allow
Pero
them
tiene el
to
riesgo
take this on.
efectivamente de que
But there
la
is a
epidemia
risk
crezca,
that
¿no? Que aumente.
demonstrations
Ahora no, la
will
gente está con
increase.
miedo
Right
desde
now,
las casas
no,
en
because
muchas
people
partes por
are
cuarentena,
fearful. They remain home
pero en la medida
very
que se vaya
frequently because
liberando
of the
todas
quarantine.
esas
But
restricciones,
as the restrictions are gradually lifted, If there
adecuada por parte
is
de los gobiernos.
no
Hay
response
un
by the government,
paquete de estímulo
a
fiscal
good
aquí
response,
necesario
if
y
there isn't
realmente se
a
hace
good
cargarse. Y además la gente,
fiscal stimulus,
yo
and if
creo que
people
parte de
haven't
eso
heard
realmente es
about it,
falta
because
de,
an important
de
part of these
diálogo. Y yo creo que se
protests is that there
requiere
is no
diálogo,
dialogue.
digamos,
I
de
believe that it's
de
necessary to
autoridades
have a
con
dialogue
distintas
between the
instituciones.
authorities and different
Qué sé yo,
institutions.
el convocar
I don't
a
know,
un diálogo
perhaps
social, ¿ah?
convene a social
Incluir también
dialogue,
a los
including
sindicatos, a los
the
empresarios. O
trade
sea,
unions and
todos,
business
todos son
people.
parte del problema, los que
Everyone
parecen
is part
parte
of the
todos son
problem, but
sumamente
they're also
importantes.
part of the solution, and
Que los
understanding
parlamentos
that is
también,
crucial.
pero también el
Likewise,
actor social, no
Parliament,
solamente el
and
mundo
but
político.
social actors also,
Porque yo
not only
creo
the
que
political
justamente
environment or
se ha
world.
dado la situación. Mi hipótesis es la siguiente,
My
porque yo el año
hypothesis
pasado
is
empecé
the
a
following.
seguir,
Last
y vi
year,
también que en África, pero en
I
otras partes,
started to look at this in
y yo
Africa
creo
and
que
other
ha
parts of the
pasado algo
world.
que,
We have
esto que
seen
decimos de volver a construir,
something,
reconstruirnos mejor,
as I was
puede
saying, we
ser una
need to
oportunidad. ¿Por qué?
build, but we need
Porque
to
yo he visto
build
que
better. We have
las
an
personas, los
opportunity
ciudadanos,
here.
han
People,
empezado a ver una
citizens,
tremenda desconfianza en las
have
instituciones,
don't have
en las
any
instituciones
confidence
en
in the
general,
institutions in
pero también
general. They
tiene
have
que
no
entrar
trust in them
en las
whatsoever.
instituciones
But more particularly
políticas,
when it
o
comes
sea,
to
sea
political
gobierno,
institutions,
parlamento,
whether it be government,
pero
parliament.
frente a un cuestionamiento a todo, a la
But
justicia,
then
a la
ultimately they're
policía, a las Fuerzas
questioning
Armadas, un
everything,
cuestionamiento a todo. Entonces
questioning
empieza a tener
justice,
la
police, armed
sensación los
forces.
ciudadanos de que la
So the
democracia
citizen has the
no está dando
impression that
respuesta
democracy is not
adecuada
providing the right response,
en lo social, en lo económico.
whether it be social or
Pero
economic.
por otro lado, un
On the
sistema
other hand,
económico
an economic
que
system
había aumentado la pobreza, había aumentado
where poverty had
lo
increased,
vimos
hunger
antes
had
del COVID,
increased,
venía aumentando, aumentaban las desigualdades al interior de cada país y entre países. O
inequalities
sea,
increasing
yo
within
realmente creo que es
countries
una
and between
oportunidad para
countries.
reavivar
This has to be an
y
opportunity
repensar
to take a
esta
new
nueva
look, to
economía,
rethink
digamos, ¿no?
a new
Más
economy,
allá de que sea inclusiva y más
where
verde y
it
más
has to
azul,
be inclusive, greener,
tenemos que pensar
obviously.
porque las
But we
desigualdades
need to think
han
about this
venido
because
incrementando en el mundo.
inequalities have been increasing in the
Y por lo
world.
tanto es claro que la gente termina en un
So
sistema político
people
que no
ultimately
confía,
have a
un sistema
political
económico
system
que
that they
está
can't trust
generando
and
más
an economic
brechas. Entonces yo creo que esta
situation that
tiene que
is
ser una
generating
oportunidad
more gaps. This is an
para
opportunity
repensar. Y hay
to
gente, ¿no?
rethink.
Gente que
And
está
there are
pensando.
people who are doing
La
that.
otra vez tuvimos una conversación con Ángel
I
Gurría
had a
y un grupo de
conversation
¿no?
from Angel
sobre,
Gurria and
sobre
other
cómo
people
el mundo cuando salgamos
as
del
to
COVID, cómo va
how
a
the
ser ese mundo,
world
cuáles son los elementos clave.
post-COVID, what kind of
Uso
world
mucho la
will we
palabra
see? What are the
resiliencia, entre otras cosas,
key elements? I
pero
use the term
yo creo que esta es una
resilience and
buena
some other
oportunidad
words very frequently.
para
But I
repensar
think we
eso,
have a
porque
real opportunity here
esto
to rethink the
no se va a
world.
terminar, no va a
This is
terminar.
not going to end.
La gente se va a manifestar si
People
sienten que su
are
vida,
going to
sobre todo
manifest if
cuando
they feel that their
se
life,
han vivido
especially when
sometidos.
they have lost their loved
Conversaba yo hoy día con
ones.
una colega
I
que
was
está en
talking
Francia,
with
me
a
decía
colleague in France
cada
today.
uno de ellos de su generación,
Everyone in their own
bajo
generation,
kilómetro más o menos,
a bit
no
younger
sabe
than
que
me,
viajó a
some of them,
Francia, ¿no?
but everyone knows
Que hay
somebody
ciertas
who
generaciones
died
donde, claro,
because
la
there
gente
is a
no vive.
certain
Entonces,
generation
yo
where there
diría,
is
creo que
greater
tiene que
risk,
ser una
obviously.
oportunidad,
So this has
decía,
to be
para
an
repensar,
opportunity. We need to seize it as an
creo que ni el
opportunity
modelo
to
político ni el
rethink.
modelo
I
económico
think neither the
están en
political or economic
en esta
model
altura, están
are
tan.
at the height of the
Y yo tengo la impresión
circumstances.
de que la
I
gente
get the impression that
quiere un
people
sistema democrático sin
want
duda, pero
a
democracia se
democratic
sujeta
system, but democracy is
a
not
causas.
simply
Democracia
to
es
vote every so
cómo
many
yo
years.
manejo las
Democracy
instituciones de la sociedad,
is how can I be
cómo ser
part of
escuchada y
building
tomar
society? How can my voice be
tampoco se
heard
trata de
and
hacer un
taken into
ejercicio,
account?
escuchar sin hacer
It's
caso,
an exercise of
sino que de
listening to
verdad
oneself.
cómo uno puede
But
mirar que la
truly
participación de las personas
look at the participation of
nuestra
persons
contribución, no es
to
verla
make a
como un riesgo.
contribution. It has
En
to be
muchos casos
viewed
los
as input
gobiernos
and not risk.
a veces,
And very
claro, puede ser
frequently,
tentador,
governments, well, yes, it
porque
might be
quizá a uno le
uncomfortable.
hablan de
They
un
might
tema
be hearing things
que
that
no son
one
agradables, pero
doesn't
yo creo que
really like hearing. But
conocer
it's crucial
realmente los
to
problemas,
truly
tener políticas centradas
understand
en las
the
personas, no
problems,
que las
to
personas se
listen
adapten
to
a una
people,
política,
and
¿no?
not only expect people to
A sistemas
adapt
que son
to the
rígidos y que muchas veces
policies.
no responden a
Sometimes
la
the
realidad de
systems
cada
are
uno.
rigid and they
Entonces,
don't
yo creo que
satisfy the
es clave
realities.
eso, más diálogo,
And that is
más
crucial.
discusión,
More dialogue, more
más ponerse de
participation,
acuerdo como país
agree
en
as
los
a
elementos
country
clave
on
y
key
cuáles son, yo
elements,
diría, los mínimos
which
civilizatorios que debería tener
are
todo el
the
mundo
minimum
asegurado. Y por
indicators
supuesto,
that
y
everybody needs
otro
to
gran
have
desafío que
assured.
tenemos
And another
es
challenge that we
cómo
face
volvemos a tomar
is how,
lo antes posible
as
la
soon as
Agenda
possible,
2030. Pues
can
tenemos 10
we
años de que llegue
retake
alguien que diga
Agenda
caramba, y la
2030?
Agenda
We have 10
2030 de Desarrollo
years to
Sostenible
reach
justamente lo que
that
busca era no
deadline.
dejar a nadie atrás,
And what
cargarse ese
people
carro
wanted to achieve by then is that there was nobody lagging we had dealt with all inequalities through measures and objectives that were defined by all countries and accepted by all. But there's a risk now because now resources are going to be used in a different direction. Had we been in a better situation, we would have uh, perhaps been in a better situation to deal with this
Adelante,
virus if
Presidenta.
we
Otra
had
pregunta
worked
muy,
on that a
muy
bit more.
cerrada
Thank you,
del enlace
President. Another
de
question. You
la
spoke
migración.
about
Le quería preguntar
migration.
si le
The
preocupa que se
question
vuelva
is,
más
are you
xenofobia
concerned
y
about
qué
there
podemos hacer
being
para
more
preservar la
xenophobia? And what
solidaridad
can
que
we
se ha
do to
mostrado hasta
preserve
ahora con la
solidarity
comunidad
deployed thus
venezolana?
far, for instance, with
Yo
Venezuelan
creo
migrants?
que efectivamente se ha generado
Yes,
xenofobia.
indeed, there is
Eh,
more
y
xenophobia.
yo creo que, primero, no sé si ustedes se
First,
acuerdan cuando
I don't know if
partió
you recall,
la
but
pandemia,
when the pandemic began in
en muchas
China,
partes las personas
Europe, and
que
other parts of the
pues eran
world,
maltratadas.
people who had Asian
Después
physiognomy
cuando estaba
were
Europa,
mistreated.
las
Then
tropas
in
de Rusia,
Europe,
después en algunos
the peace
lugares los trataban mal porque decían que
forces
ellos iban a traer
were
la epidemia.
mistreated because people thought they were
Aquí
bringing the epidemic
sacan
into the
lo mejor
country.
y lo
So
peor de las
fear
personas muchas
brings
veces, y
out the best and
lamentablemente
worst
muchas
in
veces es lo
people
peor.
frequently.
Y segunda,
Unfortunately, it's the
no hay
worst
que
more
culpar.
often. And we're always
Ya lo hemos visto
looking to
ya
see
lo
who
hemos
we
visto
can blame.
lamentablemente con los
We
migrantes.
have seen this,
Pero por otro
unfortunately, with
lado,
migrants.
también ha
Moreover,
faltado coordinación
there has
entre
been
los
a lack of
países.
coordination
Yo
between
hablaba con
countries.
el presidente de mi
I
país la otra
spoke
vez
to the
porque ellos
president
son
in
muy
my
cerca de las
country
embajadas,
because
de
there
las
were
fronteras,
people at
pero
embassies
no
or
podían
at
entrar
the
a esos
borders,
países
but they were
porque
not
tenían
allowed
cerrado.
into the country
Yo
because
decía,
the
era la
borders
reacción
of their own
política en
country were
realidad
closed. So
de
the
acuerdo al
problem of
problema. No se puede ver
migrants
y
need more
requiere
global
generar
understanding. It cannot be
respuestas más
unilateral.
integradas.
We need
Si
to
yo
have
abro mi
integrated
frontera,
responses. If
sí,
I
eso
open my border but
es
you
difícil
close
hacerlo.
yours, then it's very difficult for people
Nosotros
to
creemos
move.
que los
We
migrantes
believe that
que han querido
migrants
volver a sus
who have
países,
wanted to return to their
ojalá los
countries,
países los reciban.
well, hopefully their countries
Y
welcome them
claro, tener
back
un lugar
and
para
that
ponerlos en
they
cuarentena
find a place
14
to put
días.
them in a 14-day
Así
quarantine.
nosotros lo hicimos en
That is
nuestro caso
something
en
that we
Bolivia,
did
por
in our
ejemplo.
country in our interaction with Bolivia,
Se
for
pusieron de
instance.
acuerdo los
The
alcaldes, el
mayors
gobierno,
reached
nosotros como
agreement as
Naciones
well
Unidas
as the
también apoyamos
government,
en el
and with the
proceso.
United Nations, we
Entonces,
also supported them
yo creo que eso es
in this
clave porque
process. And
efectivamente
that
hay un
is
riesgo
very
muy alto
important. There is a very high risk
de que sean maltratados,
that
sean
migrants be
anónimos.
mistreated,
Muchos de ellos
and
trabajan
many of
en
them,
países,
furthermore,
no de
work
origen, sino de
not
destinación.
in the country of
Muchos de ellos
origin,
vienen
but
después
of
de México y han
destination,
perdido el
and they
trabajo.
want to go back to
Muchos
their
de ellos
country of
trabajaban en la
origin because they
informalidad.
have lost their work. They
Y
worked
bueno,
in the
tienen
informal
condiciones muy
sector,
dramáticas con sus
and
niños en
they
la
are
calle.
in very
Entonces,
dramatic
yo creo que
situations
eso es
with
un
their
problema
children.
de
They're
una
in the
respuesta
street.
colaborativa y
So
no
we need a
individual,
more
no
collaborative and
solamente
global
verse
response,
unilateralmente.
and not simply good bilateral
Presidenta,
understanding.
sé que se nos está acabando el
President, I
tiempo.
know that we're coming to
Me
the end
siempre
of
me
our
gustan
time,
esto
but I
en
always,
estas
in these
conferencias que tenemos,
conferences that we
siempre
hold, I always
preguntarse uno
like
qué
to
de positivo
ask,
dentro de todo
what
esto.
do
Y
you
usted
see as
siempre recuerda
positive in
cómo la
all of
humanidad,
this?
cómo ha logrado
And you recall
en que sus
humanity
momentos más difíciles son los donde se
when the
solo a la
most
creatividad,
difficult
es
moments
donde
is
encontramos
when
esos grandes artistas, los
creativity
grandes literarios, pero
shows
también
its
las
face.
grandes
We have
innovaciones.
seen this for the
Cuando usted
great
se siente y
artists and
piensa en
also
esta época
innovations.
que
When you
nunca nos
think about
imaginamos
these
vivir,
days that we never
¿qué le
imagined
hace
we'd ever
pensar en
see,
positivo?
what are you thinking of as being positive?
Mire, yo quiero pensar que esto dramático, tremendo,
I would like to think that this dramatic, tremendous situation may be an opportunity to, as I said a while back, an opportunity for women to have a different role, that there will be a cultural shift, that this is an opportunity that we were not prepared for. Even the most powerful nation on the planet was not prepared. So, how can we be ready?
sea con este virus o por otro.
We may well find ourselves again in this situation, either due to this virus or some other one. Now, it is an opportunity to reassess our societies, our economies, our relationship with nature, because
Van a llegar muchos virus más.
the truth of the matter is there will be many more viruses and we're not going to be prepared. So let's make every effort possible to reassess, to take stock of humanity, and to determine what is truly important, what is really relevant. Of course, if we know that the inequalities are so deep-rooted and that many of them coincide, let's think of that when we come up with ways to respond to our current prices and also when we get into our economic recovery. Let's include deep-rooted transformations that will deal with the underlying causes of all of this. And I think that that is where the opportunity lies. Now, I think that all of the discussions on women, for example, have been very interesting, and I have been involved in many different discussions that are related to women at different levels. So I would like to see this as an opportunity to assess the underlying problems in our societies. We are such an unequal hemisphere and an unequal world. Well, Madam President, I want to thank you very much for your time, for the fresh perspective that you always bring, and for touching on such sensitive issues that are going to require major corrections. As you said very rightly, we have to find ways to solve problems that for years we have left unaddressed. Politically, it would have been difficult to solve these problems, but you do bring us hope, and you have shed a great deal of light on all of these issues. So thank you, and enjoy your afternoon.